The way today's session is going to work is that Agnes has got some questions she's going to ask the panellists to get things going, and then we'd love if you would join in and ask some questions as well. And you can do that through the chat button at the bottom, so just type your question in there. If you're directing it to one particular person, just name who that is so that Agnes can see. If you don't name a particular panellist, Agnes will assume that you're directing the question to the whole panel. And just to give you a bit of a quick background on the report, so this is the report that was brought out a week ago today by ourselves and Community Woodlands Association, and written by David Ross, a journalist and author. We are very aware at Community Land Scotland that as we ourselves were rescheduling our year, that our members often had services already up and running to help people in their community. And I think phoning around a lot of our members, we were very aware of how quickly and effectively many community landowners have been able to respond, and the diversity of different services they've been able to get up and running. So we really wanted to produce the report to try and capture some of that so that other people could learn about that, and also to look and see what we could learn for the future as we come out through the economic recovery. So that's a very quick overview. If you want to see the report, it's on our website, and you can download it from there. So I'm just going to hand over now to Agnes Rennie, who's going to chair the rest of the session.
Thanks very much, Lindsay, and hello everyone. Great to see so many people joining in this afternoon from all over the country. I think this is a subject that's clearly interested people since the report was launched. The activity on social media and elsewhere has been amazing, and the response to it has been very, very interesting. For those of us who live in these communities and who are part of these organisations, in some ways, I guess, none of what is reported is a surprise to us. But at the same time, what has been a surprise and what's been a real joy has been to see the extent to which this has been a shared experience, which has meant that communities up and down the country have actually been able to respond, not just against urgency, but to respond in a really positive way that's created something that will go on, I truly believe, long beyond when we start to come out fully out of this lockdown period. Who knows what's ahead in that regard. Anyway, enough from me. The plan is, as Lindsay said, that we'll have some questions, first of all, from myself to each of the panellists, and that'll be quite wide-ranging, but we'll then have an opportunity to take questions from any of yourselves. So please think about, indeed some of you may well have questions already, and if you do, then start putting these up and we'll know what's ahead. But if questions occur as you listen to our panellists, please get them into. I can't promise to take everybody's questions, and there may well be overlaps. I think it's fairly inevitable in this kind of discussion. So hopefully you'll all get questions to you'll all get replies rather to any questions that you might have. And we'll see how much we can get through in the next hour. So for about the next half hour, I'll lead the questions, and after that we'll take your questions, and we'll then have a quick summary at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panellists, all of whom I'm sure are well known to most, if not all of you. First of all, John Hollingdale, who's with the Community Woodlands Association. So John will be bringing a particular perspective to this discussion. David Ross, the journalist and author, whom, as you will all know, is the author of the report that's the starting point for our discussion today. And it'll be very interesting to hear David's overview coming at it, as it were, not from outside entirely, but certainly bringing a perspective that you wouldn't necessarily have when you're so directly involved as some of us are. Martin Avila from Kinning Park Complex. Martin, some of you will have seen in previous discussions that have been run by Community Land Scotland. and Martin comes with us very much with the urban perspective. And Callum MacLeod, our Policy Director at Community Land Scotland. And last but not least, on a very short notice, Ailsa Rayburn, Chair of Community Land Scotland, who has stepped in at the very last minute, I have to say, and thank you very much for doing that, Ailsa. Today representing the Isle of Egg Trust, because our panellist Lucy Conway unfortunately had to pull out for personal reasons at literally the last minute. So thanks very much for joining us, Ailsa. We will try and save you from the very hard questions, but I know that hard questions are not a problem as far as you're concerned. So I think what I'd like to do is as a very general question to start with, and if I can ask for fairly short and succinct answers to this, so that we don't kind of have a rerun of other questions that we might come to. And that's in terms of your own perspective, why do you think community landowners in their different forms have been able to respond, as we now see it, so well to what's happened over the last 3 months? And if I can start maybe with yourself, John, just on that one.
Okay, so I think we all acknowledge there's been this fantastic community response across Scotland from a whole range of organisations and ad hoc groupings of neighbours and so on. But community landowners in particular have assets and resources and capacity to allow them to respond in particular ways. And I think the report does an amazing job of illustrating that. But I'd add something else, because I think it's in their nature. A lot of community landowners, whether talking about whole estate buyouts like Egg and Knoydart, or owners of individual assets like buildings or smaller community woodlands, the reason they got involved in the first place was to acquire and use these assets to address the issues and challenges their communities faced, recognising basically that if no one was going to do it for them. And so I think community landowners start with this mindset: if we don't do it, no one else will, which has meant that they were kind of pointed in the right direction, that when the crisis came along, that was part of their ethos to get involved. So I think that's been a big part of it.
Thanks, John. Ailsa.
Thanks, Agnes. Yeah, as Agnes said, I'm here on behalf of Egg, but with my CLS hat on as well. I'm the independent chair of Egg, although obviously not based on the island. So I certainly think from an Egg perspective and other organisations that I'm involved with, it is that sort of community credibility, in that quite a lot of occasions the local community landowner, community trust is very visible. People expect it to do things, they're used to it doing things for them and addressing local issues. So it's perhaps a function of the fact that sort of local democracy is not that local anymore. So the local community land trust is visible and is able to respond. As John says, it was set up specifically to deal with needs in that community, so it's used to responding to needs of the community and trying to come up with innovative solutions. And I think it is that sort of less risk averse approach that community land trusts that can take, where perhaps other organisations can't take, that they're able to respond really quickly and come up with different ways, different ideas of responding to their own very local circumstance. So what would be appropriate on Egg might not be appropriate on Gear or in Kinning Park or in Knoydart, but they know their local community and they know what's required, and they also know the constraints they're working in. So whether that's ferry constraints or broadband constraints or other constraints, they come up with solutions that are not one size fits all, but very specific to their local area. So I think that enabled them, particularly in this crisis, to say, right, the issues for us are A, B, C, D, and E, and this is how we can address them. And you know, absolutely no criticism of local authorities, because I think they did do a fantastic and are doing a fantastic job, but they operate across such a broad area, particularly say Highland Council. It's quite difficult for them to be able to respond on a very sort of local, granular level like that.
Okay, some interesting points there. Martin, your perspective will be different, I know, and yet there are loads of similarities.
Yeah, I think, you know, in the pre-prepared answers, I've now ticked off every single one, and so I think, you know, where we're going is to say, well, why? Because I think that it is definitely assets and the reasons for the organisations existing that's meant that they're able to respond so quickly. But I think, what is it about the assets? I mean, we all know that wealth brings resilience. You're better able to deal with challenges should you have the resources to be able to do that. And having assets around which you can generate essentially what is wealth for your community has meant that we don't have to worry about our own survival at this time, not at least immediately, and we could immediately start to be deployed and meeting the needs. And why is it that we're able to be risk averse? I think being a smaller, more agile organisation means that it's much more easy to mitigate that risk, to really understand what the risk is within a specific locale or what the risk is with a specific action, and then take steps to be able to mitigate those risks as well. And so I think everything that John and Ailsa said there about organisations are focused exactly on their local community, and that they are able to, come up with responses and solutions based on the needs and the challenges that they have within that community, backed up with having the resources and the wherewithal to be able to do that.
Thanks, Martin. I will come back to a number of these points, I think, later on. But just while we're on this question, Callum, from your own perspective, really taking a strategic view from within CLS, how does it look to you?
Well, thanks, Agnes. I think this experience and community landowners' response to it confirms really is just the vital role and place that these organisations, urban and rural, have in relation to delivering a range of services, providing responses that are absolutely tuned in and appropriate for the communities that they ultimately serve. And I think a lot of what's been said already, I would just echo in terms of them as organisations, us having the infrastructure in place, and often the maturity in place as organisations to be able to respond, as Martin said, in very agile, flexible ways to the types of challenges that have been thrown up by the pandemic in this instance. But moving forward, how we think about how we capture the lessons and experience of community trusts in this context, and think about how we channel that beyond the pandemic itself. So I think there's an awful lot there that we can reflect on and use to kind of really ideally have some pretty fundamental and transformational change in society, and where community landowners and community trusts actually have a really pivotal role to play in delivering all sorts of different benefits for the community and more generally for the public.
Thanks, Callum. David, I deliberately waited to come to you to the last in this question, because I think your view as the author of this report and as somebody who has looked at this this movement, I guess it's fair to say, over many years now, it'd be very interesting to hear how you see it in terms of how these communities have now responded to this crisis.
Yeah, Angus, well, there's a few points that have been made already that I was going to make, but just I think it's very important that the early buyouts, which set the whole thing running, were specifically to address pretty serious local problems, and there were no other answers left. And for the large majority, these were resulting from failed private ownership. After the community model was up and running, publicly owned assets then came into sight, but they were set up to tackle problems, and I think this last 3 months has shown that this sense of local responsibilities in their DNA that I've written down here, that they knew they had to act, and in fact so many local people expected them to act, because they couldn't actually, in essence, they couldn't have succeeded in the original buyouts unless they had local support. And so far, I don't know, I mean, there's always criticism from within some, but I don't know of any that could be really said to have failed miserably. Well, one of the other things that did occur to me was that unprecedented has been the most overused adjective to describe the threat posed by the pandemic this last 3 months, and they have been indeed exceptional times, which could easily have exposed, and perhaps did expose, a kind of vacuum of responsibility because when lockdown first began to loom, nobody really knew who was going to take charge on the ground. The Scottish Government was clear in its stay-at-home message, but what on earth was that going to mean on the ground within different communities? And I suppose think of it, times gone by, the natural inclination of many would have been to look to the councils or the NHS health boards, but the fear was the latter was going to be swamped by the COVID-19 spread, and after a decade of austerity and resulting public expenditure cuts, local authorities simply had no capacity to act. And this is where the community body stepped in. And one of the things that I'm quite happy to talk about this later, but it really did impress me and perhaps even surprise me, although in retrospect I shouldn't have been surprised, but was the speed with which they stepped up. There was no blueprint for this. Nobody was handing down, this is what community, but so they acted, and in a way they also adapted. A great deal of pragmatism was displayed about who should act. And for example, I live in Cromarty, and we've got, I'm a member of the Cromarty Community Development Trust. The only single physical asset we have is a 17th century barn, which is not much good in a pandemic. But there is a community project that's run for community care, which is headed by two local doctors. Two doctors, they're not local GPs, but so obviously they kind of led, they took the lead, but the other community council and the trust came in. So there doesn't seem to have been any evidence of any kind of jostling for position or whatever. It was just pragmatism right down the line. Let's do the best for our communities, and I think that was pretty impressive.
We stay with the speed of response for a minute, because that takes me to one of my own questions. Because the speed of response and the agility with which these organisations have been able to step back, step up, reform, regroup, pull in their own staff, but also pull in volunteers, is something that's been remarked on often in the last few weeks, and it's something that's specifically raised in your own report. Why do you think that was, David? And I'm going to come to one or two of the other panelists on this one too.
Well, I think that the one thing that was successful in the end, I mean, we could argue it's far too late, but the reality of the threat had come through, it had got through. I was thinking about what we might be talking about later on about climate change, and it got through in a way that climate change hasn't really on the ground. And everybody knew somebody who might be in need of help. And I think in a way that the community efforts were exploiting an actual inclination to help somebody locally who's in need of help, neighbours and etc. And I think that just fueled the whole initial response. I mean, I think the challenge in the future is going to be what you do with all the volunteers, but to give them a cause to carry on, and that is going to be a challenge. But it certainly, as I say, here in Cromarty, it was over 10% of the population became volunteers, which was, you wouldn't get that in anything else.
Not at all. Martin, the environment that you work in, you're talking about huge numbers of people. I'm just going as a direct contrast to the kind of size of community that David has described that he himself lives in. But yet the process was not all that different, was it? And your ability to respond with speed was not all that different.
No, I wouldn't say that it was. I mean, each community comes with its own challenges, and obviously the challenges of geography aren't as acute for us because the 15,000 people that maybe fall within our local area are all within walking distance, and so we were able to respond to the challenges that we had, and so and we were able to take steps that we wouldn't have been able to do because of the large amount of resources that were put into place so quickly. That both being our own resources, which we said, okay, let's just do what we have to do, and we'll figure out how we're going to sustain it afterwards, because there was no chance to sit down and think about, well, if we start doing this, how do we stop? We knew we could do something, we knew we could start it, and we believed we would find a way to be able to continue it. And so I think that some of the biggest challenges in the past would have been contacting all the people within the local area, especially when digital divide is a reality for communities across Scotland, you know, no matter where. But we were able to chat doors and put leaflets through doors just because of the sheer number of human resources we had made available to us through those volunteers, and also because rather quickly there was resources to be able to back up the efforts that started to come through, both from you know, private sources in terms of trusts, but also within local and national government, and also because flexibility, I think, especially from, you know, some funders, especially Scottish Government, where they were able to say, okay, you know, you have money which is targeted on meeting a need, which is primarily around inequality and poverty. So let's throw out the outcome and outcome indicators, or let's throw out the outputs that you already had. Let's focus on those outcomes and do whatever you want, you know, to be able to meet that. So I think there was a level of trust amongst, you know, the communities and the stakeholders that allowed us to start quickly and then to keep following up those efforts.
Thanks, Martin. I'd like to kind of segue along from that now to look at it from literally the economic impact. John, looking at where we are, where do you see, and moving forward, where do you see these communities that we're talking about and these community organisations being able to bring that same ability and agility to actually making something positive out of this, or keeping this positivity alive?
You mean it's kind of in terms of kind of the broader economic recovery? Yes. Or
yes, yes, I do.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think one of the things that's been interesting and been challenging for a lot of community organisations is that the ones who, in some cases, who've been hit hardest are those who'd kind of gone furthest down the road to social enterprise and trading, and that particularly some of our kind of colleagues in the community sector who have retail outlets and cafes and so on. They've been the ones who've hit hardest. So the burden, if you like, of the economic burden hasn't fallen equally across the community sector, and different bits have felt it much harder. And that's something that we're still, I think, in the broad community sector trying to get our heads around how we kind of make the sector more resilient. I think there's also a very big picture issue about, you know, this lesson to all of us that our economy, and that doesn't really matter whether you're talking about Scotland or the UK or the global economy, isn't very resilient. And this the coronavirus pandemic has demonstrated that the depth of the shock and the ongoing economic damage that we're all going to face is something that we still haven't bottomed out yet. And the last thing I would want to do is kind of diminish the tragedy of 60, 70,000 excess deaths in the UK, but the reality is it probably could have been much worse. And so it's really important as we go forward that we don't end up just thinking of this as a one-off event. This was a thing that happened and it'll never happen again. We need to kind of, into our planning, see this as a warning sign. It could very well happen again. It could very well happen worse. And we need to build a much more shock-proof economy. And I wouldn't pretend to have all the answers, but I am convinced that more local autonomy, control, and, you know, that much misused word sometimes, empowerment's a really important part of that, because it does seem to me one of the lessons is the closer to the ground and the more able you are to make rapid, nuanced, site-specific, community-specific decisions, the better response you get. And I think the more we can kind of build that into our future thinking about the economy, the better.
Callum, I want to throw you in at this stage, because one of the interesting things that you've raised is, in looking forwards in terms of economic recovery, is the idea of what you've called a rural New Deal. Do you want to say a wee bit more about that, for the benefit of all of us, really, and let's see what that then raises in terms of further discussion?
Yeah, thanks, Agnes. Well, we've talked, Community Land Scotland has talked in our submission to the Scottish Government's advisory group on economic recovery around this idea of a rural New Deal. But some of the issues that relate to that rural New Deal are actually as relevant to urban communities as they are to rural ones, but focusing specifically on the rural dimension of that. You know, we're a lot of us are very familiar with the kind of structural challenges that rural areas face and have done for years, if not decades, in terms of diminishing populations, reducing populations, and also the demographics of these resident populations going in probably not a very sustainable way, aging and so on in relation to that. So there's an important dimension with regard to how we think about addressing that demographic challenge and increasing the population of our rural areas. There's also an important aspect as well structurally about how we think about the negative impacts of concentrated land ownership in a rural context. And the Scottish Land Commission last year, as many folk will know, published a report looking into scale and concentration of rural land ownership. And one of the things, the most powerful finding that they had in relation to that was that where you have monopolistic concentrated land ownership, which are essentially issues of power, you have negative impacts. And so if we're talking about a rural New Deal, a new rural deal, we need to think about ways in which we change the kind of terms of the relationship, the power relationships in that. And community land ownership and land reform more generally has to be absolutely central to that process. And one of the things that we've argued in terms of fashioning this rural New Deal is about how we place land reform, by which, if you take the Land Reform Review Group's report's definition from 2014, is changes to the ownership and or use of land in the public interest. And the public interest is the key point here. There's an awful lot that you can think about to actually have a transformational effect for rural communities and rural areas, where you put land reform and land as a factor of production squarely at the centre of that, because that absolutely plugs into ideas of what we think about resilient places are and sustainable places are. And we have argued, Community Land Scotland has argued very clearly and strongly that resourcing and facilitating more community ownership as part of that bigger transformational process is absolutely essential to thinking about how we get more people into our communities, resident to stay there, and how that plugs into, in terms of land reform, plugging into these other areas of public policies as well. So how do we get the affordable homes that people need to live in these places? How do we generate the jobs and businesses to enable that to happen? How do we actually connect this all up in terms of land reform and community ownership into the kind of climate emergency, which is absolutely an existential threat for all of us? And there's lots that can be done in terms of putting that all together. One of the things that this pandemic has shown us, it's certainly shown me, is sometimes what the certainties that we think are here and with us permanently aren't. And what we think of as normal tends to get cut from underfoot very quickly. And we've seen that in all sorts of different ways. Our lives have been changed and transformed in that sense. But we also know that some things work very well. And one of the things that we know works from the report that David has produced is that communities and community owners have that resilience, have that infrastructure to enable things to happen that are beneficial for their communities. And we've seen that documented brilliantly in the report. But what we need to do in terms of the bigger rural picture is actually transfer that learning into the kind of deep-seated structural issues that we need to address to make our rural places more resilient, more sustainable, and address that kind of bigger picture. Now, that's about empowerment, it's about land reform, it's about having more community ownership and having that supported, and it's about community empowerment. And that's a rural issue, but it's obviously also an urban issue. So it's about how we connect all of these elements up to get that shared learning, and critically get that policy ambition and will to push that through when we emerge from this post-pandemic into this post-pandemic future that we're going to face and embrace and hopefully take forward in a sustainable way.
Thank you, Callum. I mean, I think for me, listening to you all in these various responses, I mean, the one thing that's clear is that nobody expects things to go back to where they were. And I don't know about you, but for me, if going back to where we were is what anybody is looking to, that's going to be a hell of a disappointment. Because if anything, what the last few weeks have shown us is that back where we were is not necessarily entirely the best place to be. And actually, as organisations, we've learned a huge amount in terms of what the organisations can do, but also about what working with our communities we can achieve, because it's never been done in isolation by just staff members or a small core group of people. I think the really interesting thing in so many cases is, and everybody has said it in different ways, has been the ability to harness the energy at a local level. And if I can come to you, Ailsa, one of the other phrases that gets used, not by the organisations, but often by local and national government, has been, and this actually across the UK, has been reference to so-called anchor organisations that have begun to emerge. Now, we know that these anchor organisations haven't just begun to emerge. David Ross mentioned earlier how some of these emerged a long time ago, and many others have emerged in their wake. So I guess the challenge and the conundrum now is going to be, how do we normalise these anchor organisations so that people see them as being part of the infrastructure, but not in a way that they're taken advantage of?
Yeah, that's interesting, Agnes, because I referred to my previous question about probably a bit about the democratic deficit and and that huge sort of layer that seems to be missing in terms of very councils organised at a really sort of regional level, particularly in Highlands and Argyll and Bute. And then below that, you've just got the community councils or anchor organisations. There's a big gap there. So, but I think in terms of the anchor organisations, what has been great, one of the good things that have come out of this is the recognition that community land trusts are not just about community land. It's not just about acquiring the estate and managing the estate, but it's about the much broader functions of that type of organisation. And they've been involved in all sorts of things that nobody could possibly have foreseen. And I think there's been a lack of awareness of the sorts of things that community anchor organisations have been doing. So in this crisis, they have responded with meal deliveries and prescription deliveries and phone buddy services and helping out with sort of mental health issues, as well as sort of more practical day-to-day things. And perhaps a lot of people in those communities and also out with those communities would not have seen that as being a function of those organisations. But they clearly, as Martin said, they stepped up to the mark and they just got on with what needed to be done. And that was a really broad range of functions. And the reason they were able to do that was because they had the community had confidence in them that they would do it, and they had confidence in themselves that they could do it. They had the resources and they had a bit of money behind them from the assets that they own. They were able to respond. They're not risk averse. So for all those reasons, they stepped into areas that they've never perhaps been involved in before, and that's now being recognised as to what these organisations can do. So I think that's really important, and we need to keep talking about that. So it's not just about owning the village hall and what, you know, the yoga class on a Tuesday, but actually the village hall association where I live, you know, they immediately responded and they sorted out things like food and prescriptions and then getting the co-op to deliver and making sure that the isolated 80-year-old had someone who would pop round and see her every day, etc. So it's more than just about what people might perceive they're involved with. But there is an issue that they're not now seen as the go-to for everything unless they're properly resourced. And, you know, they can be resourced probably in a much more cost-efficient way than bigger organisations because they are on the ground and responsive and they don't need to do all the research to find out what the community needs because they already know. But I don't think, you know, in terms of going back to normal, I'm sure a lot of these services that anchor organisations have been providing will continue, but that needs to be recognised, and we need to make sure that they're resourced. All of these boards are volunteers, so we need to really be careful about volunteer fatigue and burnout, particularly as they extend their services. Quite often it's only one member of staff and they're managing the island estate as well as making sure, you know, hot meals are delivered. So we need to think about how we resource it in the future. But I think they have proved that they are really valuable, useful organisations in how our civil society works. And they need to, you know, what they can offer needs to be considered when we're going to the next stage of recovery. So these really strong anchor organisations are there. Let's make use of them, but let's not abuse them. Let's make sure they're resourced in a way that enables them to continue to respond. As Callum also mentioned, you know, one of the areas that a lot of community organisations are interested in is about how those local communities can respond to the climate emergency. So I think that's another big area of work that we need to look at and say they've stepped up to the plate when it came to COVID. How can we support them to step up to the plate in the next big issue, or the ongoing big issue around the climate?
Thanks, Ailsa. I'm going to take a question from Megan McInnes now, and then I'll go back to, we also have a question from Rona. But Megan's follows very, very directly, I think, from just some of the points that you made there, Ailsa. And I'm going to go to Martin in the first instance for some response. And Megan's question is, I'd like to ask about what conditions are required to help enable this increase of localism and community empowerment we all recognise is essential in moving forward. What changes to the support structure from local authorities are needed, and how can this be provided given they are likely to be even more stretched than before the pandemic? I think a very real issue, in particular your own situation, Martin.
Yeah. I think I'm glad to have a chance to answer that question. Before I do, I'd like to do something dangerous, which is just to challenge you, Agnes.
Oh my God, that was never part of the plan now.
I just want to challenge something that said is that you know, that nobody's expecting us to go back to normal, and that nobody was happy with the way that the situation was before. Let's be really clear that there are a good number of folks who were doing quite well out of the situation before, who would be very happy for us to go back to normal as quickly as possible, and they were doing very well out of the situation. I know Vereen Nichols is in the audience, and she might argue that they were spiritually poor whilst being materially rich, and I would back that up. But materially, they were doing very well out of the situation, and those are the folks that want us to go back quicker than normal. And the only way that we won't go back is if we fight not to go back, and we fight to build something new. And so, you know, in terms of Megan's question, I think it's really pertinent, because there are going to be more demands on resources than ever. And actually, what we'll find within a situation that the community sector and community land trusts, we're fetishised whilst being victimised at the same time. So there's a feeling that just because, you know, at the same time as expected as community being a byword for something that's second rate, at the same time there's a thinking that communities somehow are going to be able to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, that we'll be able to fix problems that much more well-resourced organisations haven't been able to fix up until now. And to a certain extent that's true, because there are solutions that community landowners and wealthy and resilient communities can put in when we are empowered. In terms of some of the practical first steps, I think changing procurement processes for a start, so that we stop giving away so much money to huge corporations like Brakes, and really looking, you know, no offence to Brakes or anybody else, but any huge corporations that are just extracting value. And I think having a better understanding of how value is created and what value is important, both social and economic value, and that also applies within the asset transfer. So for a start, they can stop trying to demand money for second-grade assets that they're popping off, that are mainly liabilities, and they can start having decent partnership-based discussions about how community organisations, alongside structures of local and national government, can create additional value from the assets that are already there as well. And they have to stop the short-term thinking around, okay, if we sell off a particular asset, we may get £6 million now for that asset, you know, and they have to stop thinking about what they're getting when they sell off that asset, and start thinking about all the value that's being lost when it's not being properly developed as an asset that can continue to develop value. And, you know, so local authorities spend a vast amount of money on electricity. What would the landscape be like if they made a commitment to only buy electricity from community land trusts, for example? You know, straight away we could start deploying the resources that we have in a way that create more economic and social value. So we have to start making decisions as individuals, as organisations, to use the resources that we have, to use the power, social, political, economic, to advance the interests that we would like to see. And they have to start working in partnership, because, you know, up until now, and this is not, let's not start to say that it's a blame game, because you can't be in partnership with somebody over whom you have power, or in comparison to whom you are much more powerful. So that investment that allows communities to be empowered will allow organisations to come to the table with their own resources, their own assets, and really to deliver things in partnership. So we have to start making choices about using what we do have in the best possible way and doing that together.
Thanks, Martin. And I'm really glad I can rely on you to pick me up, you know, when I get it wrong. And I think seriously, the real point in that, in terms of reinforcing that perspective, is that actually there's a whole big community of people out there now with a different point of view. But that's not to say that the old view has gone entirely. John, I could see you nodding while Martin was speaking there. So I'd like to give you the chance to maybe follow up on some of these points.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole kind of level of possible answers. I mean, in some hands, there's some really relatively simple technical issues where you can support more communities, a bigger land fund, better post-acquisition support, easier mechanisms. But I think there's something much more important about power and monetary relationships that needs to be resolved, and not just with local authorities, but in that kind of the triangle of communities and local authorities and the Scottish government. At the moment, one of the problems is that I think local authorities are quite defensive in how they operate. And what we find is that communities, something I've seen all of my career with community woodlands, is that communities only ever get to take on the assets that pretty much everybody else has failed with, which echoes the point Martin was making. And I think this is true across the community sector, that communities are the owners and managers of last resort. I mean, it's extraordinary what they manage to achieve with the assets that local authorities or private landowners or whoever have pretty much given up on. But I think we need to kind of rethink the power relationship so that local authorities are in a happier position to be able to say, yes, actually take this on, rather than we can't possibly let that go because it impacts on our other services and so on. Because that's always the thing, that public bodies in particular keep the assets, if they possibly can, that they feel are valuable to them and important to delivery of services, and don't look at it in terms of actually what's the best way to deliver this service that's required. So there's something that's needed to empower public bodies, and I think that goes beyond local authorities, to start looking at what's the best way to deliver a service, rather than how can we somehow maintain our budget and influence and employment levels and not get hammered if that's reducing. And I think that the Scottish Government has a really important role to play in that, in allowing and supporting that. We can't just make it as between communities and local authorities, because that's not the whole picture. That's my point.
Thanks, John. Something that came back to me there just as you were speaking, and a word that we haven't heard so much of recently, but let's not forget that that's the world we did live in prior to this, was the world of austerity. And David, I wonder, just when you were pulling your report together, did the word emerge at all, and was there any sense of people looking at where we are now in the context of that austerity, economic austerity that we were all being asked to live by?
Well, I think in general there was an acceptance. To be fair to yourself, Agnes, I think you actually said that more or less we couldn't return, despite how somebody wanted to what had gone before. But I think there was it'd been repeated so often that going back to what was there before is, is just not on for so many people. Except Martin's point, there certainly are some who would love to, and also the fact that the default position, the natural instinct of government in general, is to try and achieve where we were before whatever bad thing happened, and that's seen to be a mark of success. So the challenge is certainly there about how to ensure that doesn't happen. I think austerity is, sorry, that's my phone here, was mentioned over and over again, and I think most people saw what they were doing during the pandemic of a statement away from that. We couldn't go back to that. And this was effectively showing that we couldn't go back, that it was relying on volunteers on the ground to make sure people were safe. And so we couldn't return to that. There was one other point I just wanted to make, was something Callum was making as well, about I have slight concerns that the atmosphere amongst our politicians has changed somewhat to what it was 20 years ago, when Ass and Egg, Noidert, Gia, etc. were all starting. I don't know whether Callum would agree with this or not, but whether there's the same appreciation of what you were fighting there was just such decay and kind of just places that were going nowhere. And I think politicians at the time certainly got that. I'm not so sure they all do now.
Callum, do you have a view?
Yes, I do. And I think it's a really important point about where land reform sits as a process, and community ownership sits as a process within the broader realm of public policy in Scotland, and making sure that these different parts connect up. Because as David has said there, I think, community ownership, to my mind at least, has always been about a means to particular ends. And so communities don't, well, sometimes might take ownership because it's a nice thing to do, and it can be, but it's a damn challenging thing to do as well. But they do that because they are often fighting market failure. They're fighting landlords, metaphorically, landlords who have not had the best interest necessarily at heart, and have closed off opportunities and options for their development. So I think there's a really important role to play as well with regard to just ensuring that land reform as a cross-cutting area of public policy actually stays firmly at the centre of the political agenda here in Scotland. Now, we're not a million miles away from the next Scottish parliamentary election. And so it would be extremely disappointing, to say at the very least, if all of the political parties did not have very clear ideas about how you put land and land reform and elements of that squarely at the centre of their manifestos, and take this opportunity when we are in, frankly, a state where we're slightly off balance because of the pandemic and because of climate change as well, as a society here in Scotland and globally as well, and think about ways in which we can actually connect up our relationship with land in terms of its ownership and its use to hit all these different sustainability objectives that we need to do in relation to that. And one of the things I do want to just come back to a point that Martin made earlier on around some people benefiting from the status quo, which I know isn't what you were saying, Alex, but it's true. Because we're here sitting in a state of climate emergency, and we're moving now towards thinking about a green economic recovery. Now, a great deal of that is around how we use our natural assets, and the phrase natural capital gets used quite a lot in terms of what we're doing here. Now, because of the way in which land ownership is so concentrated in predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly private hands in rural Scotland, it is those private interests who will place themselves and characterise themselves as the kind of climate saviours in some respects. And they certainly have an important role to play, no doubt about that. But the critical point is, how do you keep the wealth that is generated from these natural assets to protect the natural environment, while at the same time providing community benefits through ownership and the generation of these broader public benefits. Now, aligning that with community ownership and a much more diversified pattern of land ownership in urban and rural Scotland is absolutely central to doing that. So we absolutely, as a society, need to keep land reform absolutely at the centre of the policy agenda. The Land Reform Review Group published its report in 2015, The Land of Scotland and the Common Good. There's a great deal of unfinished business in the pages of that document that needs to be taken forward.
It's calm. Now, if you're watching your watches, you will know that this was down to schedule to finish at 3. So I've just got a message from Lindsay to reassure us that if we want the discussion to continue just a bit beyond 3, then that's fine. We're not going to have anybody cut off mid-sentence. And I think there's some really interesting points coming up, and 1 or 2 that I'd certainly still like to come back to. However, if anybody does have to leave at 3 and has a question to ask, if you alert us to that now, then happy to make sure that your question gets asked. Can I just pick up on that final point from yourself there, Callum, in relation to the climate emergency? And I think David made reference to that at the very beginning of this hour too. And increasingly we hear reference to how, in fact, that is going to be part of moving forward. And can I come to you, John, in the first instance, and maybe just give you an opportunity to say a little about your own thoughts in that regard, how your own organisation and the communities who you work with most might have a part to play in that agenda?
Yeah, I think there's a few kind of angles to that. Obviously, in the pandemic, there's been some very specific kind of positive environmental impacts of much more home working, much less aviation. On the other hand, there's been less public transport, so it's not kind of all good. The pandemic itself, although it's been problematic for community woodland owners who've struggled and worked really hard to keep their woodlands open, and because it's not just a simple matter of saying the woods are open, you have to make sure that they carry on being safe. You have to make lots of decisions about, advising people or keeping car parks open and so on or not. And then as they come out of the pandemic, groups are working really hard and thinking really hard about how they can restart a lot of the outdoor activities, the volunteer working that are really important for mental and physical health for a lot of those participants. And I think one thing the pandemic has shown all of us is exactly how important and critical access to green space, to woodlands, and the ability to exercise has been. It's been one of the few positives that we can take from the experience, is that I think there's a much greater public realization of the importance of that, and perhaps we may end up rethinking how we zone space. Maybe less cars, more bikes, more access to green space gets built into our thinking and our planning for the future. A very much kind of wider, higher level point I would like to make, I think, are some of those of us who've been involved in kind of getting engaged in the policy discussions around tackling the climate emergency would say, is that up to now, governments, by which essentially we mean politicians, have set lots of targets, but largely sought to achieve them by means of technological fixes and kind of encouraging behaviour change rather than trying to drive it. Because, and I'm not being critical of the Scottish Government, who I think have gone further than most other governments in this respect, but it's an issue that affects all governments and all politicians. They've been essentially very timid about following courses of actions that will be seen to impact somehow on our freedom to travel and consume as we wish. And because quite reasonably, they fear they'll be going to punished at the ballot box if they do impinge on what we've come to regard as freedoms. Well, maybe the experience of the pandemic will empower politicians to think that actually we can, people are more responsive and people aren't absolutely going to rebel at the slightest impingement of freedom. If we give them good enough reasons, or if we explain why we need to make this change, and then maybe in the future it will be easier for governments to do a little more to drive change rather than simply encourage behaviour change. I mean, that's something for people at high levels of government and politicians to think about. But I do think it might be a positive outcome of this. They themselves feel that we could go a little bit further, a little bit quicker, and make many more positive pushes rather than simply saying we'll technologically fix our way out of the emergency.
Thanks very much, John. David, you made reference to this early on too. Would you like to come back in at this stage and add to that?
Well, that was my observation. I think there was an acceptance fairly early on. It became obvious there was an acceptance by the public that this really was serious, in a way that you couldn't say there's been the same general acceptance of the threat of climate change. Now, obviously, for obvious reasons, there was something imminent. There was tens of thousands of people dying already, but obviously the stakes are arguably higher now. But it's just my own feeling that that same message hasn't got through, and I think John's right as regarding, more direct instruction, in that I think everybody was surprised how well people did observe the lockdown, certainly in the early weeks. I mean, the story was that the UK government just didn't want to go down that road because they never thought that the British people would obey it, and they were pretty surprised. So I think there's certainly room for taking a more proactive line and by governments, and insisting that this is something we, the citizens, have got to do. I think that's right, but at the moment I'm not feeling, I mean, this is only a personal observation obviously, but that was my fear, but whereas the pandemic did work through very quickly into public consciousness.
Thanks, David. Ilse, I'd like to go back to a question that Rona Campbell raised quite early in the discussion, and this comes back to, reaching the community and reaching parts of the community and people in the community. And Rona's question is, has the way communities responded made it possible for the Land Trust to reach previously isolated people or those who are not engaged in the work of the Land Trust? What's your own view on that?
I can say. Yeah, I think it certainly has, and it comes back to something we've been saying earlier, that the Land Trust's seen as the local anchor organisation and getting involved in all sorts of things that perhaps people didn't realise they were involved with, or they were getting involved in new activities which had a much more sort of direct impact on people's everyday lives, if that's sort of sorting out the shopping or the prescriptions, taking your dog for a walk, or make sure that your elderly neighbours were looked after. So I think hopefully people now see that community land trusts are not just involved in, as I said, managing the village hall or managing housing or particularly asset management, but actually they have a much broader role to play. And I think certainly I can say from my experiences in Egg and Gear and where I live locally, that the community have engaged with and responded to the community land trusts, new people in the community that have never been involved before. And you have to hope that does sort of convert into people wanting to get more involved, either in volunteers or board members, or increasing the awareness of what the trusts do to create more staff posts, etc. So I think there is a real an outcome that we need to build on there, that the awareness of what community land trusts have done and can do, we need to build on that and keep promoting it. So I think, yeah, to answer Rona's question, I think, yeah, definitely there's examples of where people are now connecting and offering to help and being more aware. And I'm sure in Martin's Kinning Park, there's probably lots and lots of new volunteers that were never involved before. And it's how we retain that sort of community activist. I'm trying to sort of use that term more about being a community activist rather than a community volunteer, because you're actively working to make your community a better place. Community land trusts are a really great vehicle for doing that.
Martin, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, no, just to support, everything that's been said so far. I think it was, but what kind of lessons are there for us? Because I think there's part of it which is outside our sphere of influence, because I think all of us, went through that feeling at the start of the lockdown that there was a whole load of things that we'd been putting off doing for a long time that we knew that we should have done, whether that was fixing something in the garden or, if you're lucky enough to have a spare room. And so there's probably a lot of folks that were motivated because they wanted to be in touch before and they'd been busy and they'd been dealing with other challenges, and partly that's out of our control. But I think some of the power also comes from the fact that community land trusts started doing exactly what it was that people needed. And so people will be more likely to be involved when there's a benefit to them, you know. And so once community land trusts are able to step outside all the operational and sustainability issues that would, you know, impact upon them, really being able to go out and engage with folks, find out what it is that they want and make decisions based on that, suddenly it became very obvious what people needed. They needed food, and they needed social contact, and they needed support to access other goods and services. So it was really obvious what they needed, so we could make that need really quickly. But there has to be something in there about how we understand what it is that people want and what it is that people need, you know, and how it is that we are able to meet that. Because I think one of the things that the third sector has been quite slow to get its head round, because we suffer from a poverty trap, which is around lack of investment and trying to meet needs which are greater than the resources. We haven't always been able to upgrade our management practices. So if you look at the private sector, sometimes the private sector understand much better than we do that if you're not meeting the needs of your customers, so to speak, then as an enterprise, you're not going to survive. So they spend an awful lot of time and effort and money really understanding what it is that people want. Whereas I think sometimes within our sector, because of the poverty trap, because of the, you know, the reliance on handouts that can be, you know, a part of a situation where communities don't have their own assets, don't have their own wealth, so then they become reliant on either individual or institutional philanthropy, then we're not challenged to really understand what it is that people need. And so I think one of the things that we need to go forward with is that if we want people to be involved, we really need to be meeting their needs and be able to show them why we can do it better than somebody else. Because we're often looking for this great white knight or horse or whatever's going to ride in, and in some ways people thought it would be independence. All we have to do is tick a box and all of a sudden we're going to live in a land of, you know, milk and heather honey, or now people are thinking it's the pandemic. After the pandemic everything's going to be completely different, but it's not. We're going to have to work towards it, and I think one of the things that we're going to have to do is really understanding what the real needs are and not just what we imagine them to be, because in that sense then we'll be able to start going forward. And I think, you know, those needs, at least on a short-term level, are housing, food, energy, employment. And so I think through creating a lot of that, you know, services for our children, amenities within our local area, those who have children, services for our families, and so I think having an understanding of what it is that we can really do to improve the lives of the people in our community and what it is that people really need will be the only thing that will see sustained engagement. Because as soon as we go back to, you know, what it is that we think that we need, then there'll start to be this disconnect again, and we'll see that drop off.
It's been interesting to me, Martin, in just looking at the responses from social media to some of the things that have come up, some of the examples that are contained in the report, how people have responded to these and how people have delighted to some extent. I quote specifically Alistair McIntosh, and he was so delighted to see the commonality between your own work and that in Galson. Two places which one would imagine couldn't be further away from each other in so many ways, and yet at the same time, what has come to the fore and what's staying with people is the commonality and the learned experience, the shared experience. And I wonder, just in closing, if I can just do a quick round the table and say for you, if you just give me a kind of in a couple of sentences, what for you now gives you confidence in moving forward from the experience that you've just come through? Start with yourself, Martin.
Once people become aware of their own power and their own possibilities to exert the change that they want to see, it's very difficult to disempower people. You know, and once people start to demand change, it's very difficult to stop that. I think that some of the biggest changes in the narrative that we've seen over the last few years have been through the Me Too movement, where women started coming forward and saying, you know what, we're not putting up with this anymore. And all of a sudden it started to lead people to share experiences and question why things were the way that they had to be. And now with the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I think one of the things that gives me most hope is that when people are empowered You cannot put that genie back in the bottle. And as much as there are plenty of people who are interested in the status quo coming back as quickly as possible, there are plenty more people than before who really understand that the status quo is no longer an option. We cannot continue as is. We've never been so materially rich as a society, but we've never been so physically, mentally, spiritually sick. And so I think that empowerment process can't be stopped. Where it goes is up to us, but there's something started here, and we can go forward with that.
Thanks, Martin. David?
Yeah, going forward, well, the governments, both north and south of the border, keep saying that there's got to be an inquiry sometime. We've got to learn lessons. I think it's clear that in Scotland, one of the lessons has got to be the role that the community, these anchor organisations, did play, and we've got to make sure that they do look at that. And intriguing, what did they think was going to happen? You know, well, nobody really thought how things were going to be delivered. So I think that gives me some kind of hope that the community effort cannot be ignored in the future. And obviously it varies greatly. I was struck when I was talking to Martin on the phone about the report that I mean, he wasn't just dealing with prescriptions or shopping or that, he was dealing with a high number of refugees who arguably were the most vulnerable of all the people, of all the trusts we're dealing with, which now that's obviously a huge issue to be dealing with, but that landed on the floor at the door of a community body. And these sort of things, we can't let them forget that.
Indeed not. John, can I come to you?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things I'd say very quickly. Firstly, it doesn't matter if you're individual or an organisation. It's always difficult to know how you'll respond until you're tested. And actually, I think community landowners have been tested and their response has been fantastic. And I think that's something that this report illustrates very well, and it's something that we should celebrate and cherish. The kind of bigger perspective issue is that, yes, the changes have been forced, but a lot of the old certainties, a lot of the political rules that we used to have to live by have been swept away. You know, it's extraordinary to reflect on a UK Tory Chancellor suddenly finding vast sums of money available to do stuff when it really mattered. And that, yeah, we have to accept this was unprecedented, that overused word, but it does demonstrate a lot of the rules that used to constrain our thinking and were used to constrain our thinking actually are just constructs, and we can think wider and broader about the society that we want to build for the future. That's mine.
Thanks, John. Callum?
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, it's hugely encouraging you've captured and to see what we already know, I think, collectively, that community ownership has the infrastructure and the resilience and the empowerment to actually enable these positive things to be delivered on the ground for the people who live in these urban and rural places themselves. And so that's a really important piece of learning in and of itself. But the key challenge, I think we're probably collectively all agreed on, is how we actually take that, harness it and connect it to how we develop as a society going forward. And clearly when we're talking about economic recovery and when we're talking about Scotland being a sustainable place that's lined up to meet the UN 17 Sustainable Development Goals, addressing poverty and all the rest of it in terms of that, and being greener and more socially just, we have to place this experience and this learning and resource it in terms of making sure that land reform and community ownership of assets, land and buildings and so on, actually plugs in foursquare and centre to that process of economic recovery and sustainable development within a socially just and green Scotland.
Ailsa?
Thanks, Agnes. Yeah, I mean, there's absolutely nothing to disagree with what anyone said. But I think coming back to Martin's original point about empowering people and saying, you know, we need to make a change. You know, those early landowners, the community landowners, Egg and Golson and Assynd, they did that. They said, we're not putting up with this anymore, and we need to shift the balance of power. We need more power ourselves. We need to be more in control of our own destiny and our housing and our jobs and everything that's happening around us. And they took the step, and that would have been really difficult in those days, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So I think there's a fantastic cultural history there of people taking power into their own hands and coming together as a community, and demanding change and forcing change. And I think we're on that narrative, we're on that arc of saying, right, okay, we've done that in some places, we need to spread that idea, we need to do this in more places. It's not anymore just about owning the land, but it's about what you do with it. It's coming back to Callum's point about it's how you use it, and how the use of that land and the natural resources, the natural capital, doesn't disappear to shareholders in Germany, but it actually stays locally. So income that's generated stays locally and meets that community's need. So I think there's this fantastic examples, and there are people on the call who I can see that have been involved in that process over a really long period of time. And we need to keep telling that story. We need to keep telling the story of how putting power into the hands of communities, so giving them assets and giving them income, is really valuable and helps contribute to all the things that we've been talking about a green recovery, about building back better, about empowering people. So, you know, I think we've already made fantastic progress, but there's still a huge way to go. And there's a fantastic opportunity for us now to keep telling that story and keep asking people to listen about what's happening and what people want.
Thanks very much, Ailsa. And can I thank all our panellists this afternoon? It's been absolutely fascinating. Excuse me as chair if I've said too much, but it's very tempting to just jump in and join in such an excellent discussion. It's just so many points that we could pick up on there, and I'm not going to start doing that. What I will do, however, is commend this report to you if you haven't already had a chance to read it. I've now read it twice, and each time I found something new there. And to quote Callum's earlier comment, you know, this is all something that we probably feel we know, but we don't know it all. And we're learning about each other's communities, and we can learn even more. And in order to do so, we can share some of that experience too. Have a look at the Community Land Scotland website, look at the various blogs, and look at the small videos, short videos that are there, all really good and all telling the story of different communities, each in their own words. So thank you all very much. Thank you all those of us who joined in with us this afternoon. It's made it really worthwhile. Thank you for your questions, those of you who've asked questions. And we'll look forward to the next time. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Okay, cheers then.
We're on live.
Thank you.
Bye.
We're still live.